Something that I want to dispel with this series is the idea that all people of a similar race, ethnicity or nationality are the same, or that they should be lumped together by society as one homogeneous group. In the previous episode, Andrea spoke about how her world has been shaped by having a black Caribbean mother and a white English father. In this episode, I speak to another person with Caribbean and English heritage and gain a very different and equally compelling account of what it means to be mixed race, and indeed whether the term mixed race should even be used in the first place.
Choosing not to identify as mixed race is seen as not wanting to be white. And I don't know how you put that across, because that's not what it's about. Since I was born, I've been a mulatto, I've been a half caste, a half breed, a mongrel, I've been mixed race, I've been dual heritage. So all those names have been applied to me. I guess I reject those categories. You know, I know black doesn't exist. I know white doesn't exist. I choose to use black more than I choose to use mixed race because that's how society names me. And so because society names me as that, to interact with society, I have to give them something that they can hold on to. It doesn't mean I agree with that. And in some ways, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. Okay, so when you're a child, perhaps you say it's petrol that makes the car go. And that's a really simple way of explaining it. It's the petrol you need. We all know as adults, it's not petrol that makes the car go, it's the complexities of how the engine works, combustion, etc., etc. But to a small child, you don't explain all that because it's going to go over their head. You just say it needs petrol. And sometimes I think society needs a simplified version to hold on. I can't every time I interact with somebody go, well, actually, I reject the categories of race. I reject black and white. We know there's no biological basis. So what you're actually asking me doesn't work in terms of a societal discussion. But yeah, I am more at risk of diabetes type 2. Do you know what I mean? Because it's almost like you'd have to have this really long introduction beforehand that I can't do every time. I don't have the energy or inclination. So I use black as a shorthand. And I think white is a shorthand too. And perhaps the reason that I don't use white as a shorthand is because what it's shorthand for is power, access to things in society, etc., that I don't have. Yes, I have that in my heritage, but I don't have the things that white is the shorthand for. And so I don't use that term of mixed race or dual heritage because it would imply something that isn't true. And I think in some ways that's where I also struggle a little bit with shadeism and colorism. I absolutely accept that it exists, but I still know that society labels me a black woman and all that goes with that and what that's shorthand for. So my mum's from the Caribbean. She's born in Curacao, which is one of the islands in the Lesser Antilles. It's a Dutch island. My grandmother's from Barbados. My father's white English. I think I was very lucky, certainly until I reached my second year of senior school. I went to a church school, and in some ways that gives you all a shared identity, I think. And in that sense, I wasn't aware of my skin colour making me different. I think other things make you different in that context, but it certainly wasn't about my skin colour for me as a child. I'm aware looking back now that that definitely was the case, but as a child, that's not how I interpreted those events. It's only looking back with a kind of understanding of how racism works, if you like, and how being black in a white culture works, that I can see that that's what's going on. If you look at, for example, my family, my sister's children appear white. Now, her children, her son is the same age as my daughter. He will not face the same consequences of his mixed racedness, if you like, that my daughter will, because my daughter is visibly black. And that's where it becomes more difficult, and it depends why you're collecting that information and what you intend to do with it. But that's also where identity becomes important. For him to identify as black or white or mixed race doesn't have massive consequences for him in terms of how society treats him. He might experience some discomfort if he identifies as black and society treats him white, but he's not likely to be refused a job because of it. He's not likely to be treated differently because of the police because of it. His healthcare is unlikely to be affected by it. It's a generalisation. But for my daughter, all those things are the opposite. Her skin colour, her mixed racedness, her blackness, more importantly, will affect her access to those things, and already has. You know, that started very, very young. I remember the first time I thought, this is being said because you are black, about my own daughter, and she was still in primary school. And that's where mixed race has a really big impact, because I think it's about, like you say, we don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about race. Are we talking about nationality? Are we talking about ethnicity? Or are we talking about skin colour? And I think that's deliberate. I think that confusion is deliberate because it allows people to switch between the two and deny all knowledge. Really, we're talking about skin colour. I think that's what it comes down to a lot of the time in this context when you're talking about power, and particularly when the questions of what are you come in. If I appeared white, I would not get asked those questions. And I think that's where I have a problem with the term mixed race, because you're not actually asking whether I'm mixed. You're basically saying, I can see you're not white, and therefore I feel I have the right to ask you these questions because I'm further up the level than you are. Then I start questioning, what is the point of me identifying as mixed race? If you're talking about culture, which is another argument that comes in, so when we talked about dual heritage sort of a few years ago, that was the term that seemed to be used most. In some ways I like that because it acknowledges the reality of my existence. Dual tends to indicate two cultures. I wish I only participated in two cultures, life might be more simple. But for example, living in London, you know, that's a totally different culture from when I lived in Newcastle. So again, why are we privileging the fact that my mother comes from the Caribbean and my father comes from England over these other things? I think it comes back to power. I think what you're basically asking me when you ask me about my mixed raceness is, how much power do I have over you? How much power do I have over you? And that's also where colorism, I think, comes in. The lighter I am, the more you question how much power you have over me. The darker I am, the less you question it, because you're certain then that you have power over me. And so using that term is problematic for me, not because I'm talking about the biology, if you like, of it. I totally accept that. I am from a number of different heritages, if you like, but that term isn't about my biology, I don't feel. What I often get from people who are not Black Caribbean but who are not white is, again, trying to pigeonhole me. So I've often been told, no, you must be from Somalia, you must be from Ethiopia, and it's like, now hang on a minute. You know my family history better than I do. Okay, that's news to me. But, you know, they can get very insistent about it, very, very insistent about it. And my not accepting where they've placed me in terms of the spectrum of ethnicity is clearly a challenge to some part of them that they find unacceptable. And that's always a bit bemusing to me. First of all, I don't really understand why where I come from or where my parents come from, more to the point, has anything to do with you, impacts on your life in any way. I think it's an extremely personal question to ask. And, you know, one of the strategies I've started using is going, yeah, so where do your parents come from in return? And it's interesting to see people's responses, because then they understand quite how personal they're being. Especially if you follow it up with, no, but where do they really come from? Which is the second question I often get asked. Now, if I buy into that, I'm buying into that system. I'm buying into the system that says my race determines my worth. That's not something I want to do. I don't see fighting racism as a way of going, okay, I want to be more equal in the system that exists. No, I want a different system. You know, I'm not talking about wanting to reverse situations. I'm not saying that I want black people to be in the position that white people are in. No, I want a system where we can all coexist and where race isn't a defining factor of our coexistence and our likelihood of survival. And therefore I'm uncomfortable buying into the terminology that exists in this way. It also sets up this false binary of having to choose. You know, one of the things I love about intersectionality is that it gets rid of this idea that I'm two different things. I'm one thing. There are lots of things that come together to make me. The fact that I have a white father and a black mother are part of those. But who I am is at the intersection of those things. It's not a divided part. It's not something that's split off from itself. You can't define me in that way. And that's probably why I don't use the term mixed race very much, because I feel it buys into that binary situation, which I just don't believe exists. I had a conversation with my mother the other day, and she said that we were talking about it, and I was saying, about Meghan Markle, that was it, and how she was saying how she's being identified as the mixed race princess. And she said, yeah, I'm really sorry to you children. I thought by the time you were adults, all this stuff about race would be gone. I just couldn't believe it would still be like this. And to me, that was really sad. And it's a sign of society. But also what that shows me is society has communicated really clearly to my mother that mixed race children are a problem. Now, she understands very clearly that this is ridiculous because she thought all this would be out the way. So it was people being stupid and it would be done by now. But the fact that it's not, where has that blame lay? She feels it, not the people that should feel it, she feels it. And that's problematic to me. And that's where I think you do have to challenge it. But I don't think you can win. I think perhaps one of the problems with models of challenging racism in the past has been we expect it to be fixed in our lifetime. And I just don't think that will happen. I think the roots of racism are so deep and we refuse to acknowledge how much race is about power, because there's no biological basis. We've established that, yet another report's just come out saying how many different genes and heritages are present in any one person regardless of what their skin colour looks like. And it was saying how skin colour is a really poor way to define heritage and ethnicity, if you like, because it's just not that simple. I think it's two different things. I think you have to separate it. So I think when you're talking about a black person wanting mixed race babies, you're talking about internalised oppression. I'm generalising, obviously, but I think there's a point there where we acknowledge our blackness makes life difficult. Not that having mixed race babies is a problem or is wrong. If you want a child because you want a child, I don't have a problem with that. I think you do have to acknowledge that being brown is difficult or being black is difficult. And if you choose to have a child and that child is black, in my case, you then have a responsibility to change society for that child. And I think that's perhaps a bit that's missing, because life is going to be difficult, it's going to be challenging. Even if you have the charmed life that perhaps Meghan Markle's child might have, other people will put their prejudices, their ideas, their othering onto you, regardless of whether you accept it or not. And that's something that other children won't have to deal with. I think when white people do it, I can speak with less understanding of that, but I think part of it is the accessories thing. It's seen as exotic, Exoticism is still a massive part of our culture. It's still seen as desirable when it's viewed from afar, not when it's viewed up close. And it's also buying access to a culture that perhaps you don't have access to. I'm not saying that works, but I think that's often what goes on. It's a bit like the I've had white partners who do the thing of, it's so great to be part of black culture. It's so great. It's so amazing. The food's amazing. The music's amazing. The people are amazing. Yeah, I have to say, the racism, the police brutality, the not being able to get the job you want, the constantly having to prove that you are twice as good as somebody else, yeah, that's not so amazing.
How do we change that? Is that just it's an impossible task because you're trying to then educate the world?
No, I don't think it is impossible. I think part of that is where white studies comes in, because I think part of that comes from, to relate to somebody else, you need to understand who you are. And I think part of the difficulty with the identity of white is it's a invisible identity. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about what being white means. We don't talk about its associations. It's positive and negative associations. And I think the other side that needs to go with that is allyship. I think our models of being an ally at the moment are really poor. Often they are involve taking on the identity of black when you're not. Obviously, I don't want to talk about other cultures because I don't know enough, but in terms of black allyship, often what people do is they want to take on the identity of being black and go the equivalent of, I identify as a black person in this community, rather than saying, I recognise who I am and I recognise my privilege, and I'm going to use that to educate, if you like, those people that are oppressing those that I'm trying to ally. And I think there are ways of doing that, but I think our models at the moment for doing that are poor. I think they're poor. And I think people unintentionally do things like they'll speak on behalf of an oppressed person rather than creating a platform for them to speak. I can't tell you the number of times I've been to events where I've heard white people decrying racism on an all-white panel. If you really feel that strongly about racism, then my question is, why are you not ensuring that the event is, one, open to all black people? By that I don't just mean that you're not excluding them, I mean that you welcome them and encourage their presence as difference being an enriching thing, not a threatening thing, but also that they're not represented on the panel. If you really feel that strongly, you should be saying, you know what, I won't do it, but I know a really good black woman who can. And I think we need to see more models like that. Because I think what that does is it doesn't require you to give up who you are. It gives you a sense of yourself, but it gives you a sense of working for justice. And I think we need to adopt more of those models that do that. And I think we have to challenge the way we all as individuals think. If you think of what comes out of your mouth is a representation of what you're thinking consciously or unconsciously. And therefore, if you don't challenge how you think, if you don't accept that we all have prejudice within us and we all need to challenge that within us as well as challenging the prejudice we see outside, I don't know how we move forward. But I do find it difficult at times. I do find it difficult to say, particularly when I've had white partners, you realise that's racist. That's really difficult, especially when you care about somebody and you understand that it's going to hurt them, but they still need to know. And I always look, the way that I've sort of justified it to myself in my own mind is, if it was reversed, I would want to know. I'm not sure you can separate my race or my heritage from who I am. What I will say is, being who I am, the experiences I've had, my upbringing, the influences that have affected my life mean I really appreciate difference. I absolutely see the benefit of difference and how difference should be an enriching thing and something to be encouraged. I'm always seeking out different people to be around and to talk with, because I find I learn so much, it benefits me and it helps me to think in a different way. In the academic work I've done, I very much have focused on difference and how it enriches life, and that, if you like, the flip side is that we see difference as a threat, and that's the biggest mistake we make. Difference is something to be valued. No one person has all of the picture. So what you need is everybody to bring in their experience, and that's how you get the whole picture. And that also comes with power sharing. When you share power out amongst everybody, you get a better society. And I think that perhaps would have been harder for me to grasp if I hadn't had the influences on my life that I have had. And also, I suppose it gives me a point of view where I understand that if I see difference as a threat, that's an error in my thinking. Difference is something where I should encourage it and I should look for it, and it's not a threat to me. It's the opposite. And that's very much how I work. I find it invigorating to be around, and I welcome that a lot. And I think part of my job as a person is to make sure if ever I'm in an environment where there's only one voice being heard, that's a problem. I need to make sure that that's widened, that you try and encourage as many voices as possible, because without that you're limiting yourself and you're limiting what can be achieved. I think difference is everything, and I think it's a key to addressing most of the prejudice we see in society. A lot of racial prejudice is about unpicking what's underneath that and what your fear is underneath that, because I think once you've unpicked that, you're going to find that the fear is, it's not what you think it's about, and then B, it's something you don't need to be worrying about. I think there's something really important about understanding the way I choose to live my life, providing I'm not discriminating against you, has no impact on what you should do. Only you know the best way to live your life. And if you don't know, only you are the person that can work that out. And that's not going to be the same as me, and that's brilliant.